For over a year, 2 million soldiers were fed into a patch of frozen forest where the front barely moved and the losses never stopped. No decisive breakthrough, no triumphant headlines, only a battlefield that consumed entire armies in silence. This is the story of Rzhev, the battle that history almost buried. By the autumn of 1941, the strategic balance on the Eastern Front remained unsettled despite the rapid territorial gains achieved by Germany during the opening months of Operation Barbarossa. Following the encirclement battles at Minsk and Smolensk, German Army Group Center had advanced deep into western Russia, reaching the line of the Upper Volga. Moscow lay less than 300 kilometers ahead. However, the German offensive had already begun to exhibit signs of overextension. Supply lines stretched across devastated infrastructure, fuel and spare parts shortages reduced mechanized mobility, and troop losses mounted steadily. At the same time, the Soviet Union mobilized its remaining reserves at an unprecedented scale, transferring industrial production eastward beyond the Urals while forming new armies for the defense of the capital. The city of Rzhev, located approximately 210 kilometers west of Moscow, emerged as a key geographic and operational point during this phase. Situated on elevated terrain near the Volga River and connected by rail and road networks linking Smolensk, Vyazma, and Moscow, Rzhev occupied a central position on the northern axis of the German advance. Its surrounding region consisted of forests, river valleys, and marshlands that limited large-scale maneuver while favoring entrenched defensive operations. Control of this area offered the German command a forward base threatening the Soviet capital while simultaneously securing the northern flank of Army Group Center. In October 1941, German forces launched Operation Typhoon, the final major push toward Moscow. The offensive began on 2nd October and involved approximately 1 million German troops supported by over 1,700 tanks and 14,000 artillery pieces. Opposing them were several Soviet fronts with a combined strength of roughly 1.25 million personnel. Early breakthroughs at Vyazma and Bryansk resulted in the encirclement of multiple Soviet armies, producing massive losses in prisoners and equipment. By mid-October, German panzer formations approached the outskirts of Moscow, while infantry forces struggled through deteriorating road conditions and the onset of autumn rains. The failure of Operation Typhoon to achieve a decisive breakthrough before winter marked a critical turning point. In early December 1941, the Soviet Union launched a large-scale counteroffensive along the entire Moscow sector. Freshly deployed Siberian and Far Eastern divisions, transferred west after intelligence confirmed that Japan would not attack the Soviet Union in the east, reinforced the Red Army. Soviet forces regained ground south and north of Moscow, forcing German formations into improvised defensive positions. During this withdrawal, German units concentrated around the Rzhev-Vyazma salient, a protruding front line extending westward into Soviet-held territory. By January 1942, the Rzhev salient had assumed a distinct operational shape. It extended roughly 160 kilometers from west to east and varied between 100 and 140 kilometers in width. Inside the salient, German Ninth Army under General Walter Model established layered defensive systems supported by artillery and field fortifications. The force numbered approximately 350,000 to 400,000 troops at various points during 1942, depending on rotation and reinforcement levels. The position allowed German artillery and reconnaissance units to operate within striking distance of Moscow, maintaining a constant strategic threat despite the failure of the winter offensive. For the Soviet leadership, the presence of a large German formation so close to the capital was unacceptable. Politically and militarily, eliminating the Rzhev salient became a priority objective for 1942. The Stavka viewed its destruction as a necessary step toward securing Moscow permanently and restoring operational initiative across the central sector of the front. Soviet planning focused on multi-front encirclement operations designed to isolate and annihilate the German Ninth Army through converging attacks from north and south. Civilian life in the Rzhev region had already been shattered by months of warfare. Large portions of the population were displaced during the German advance in 1941. Those who remained faced occupation policies that included forced labor, requisitions, and deportations. Villages were systematically destroyed during both German withdrawals and Soviet counterattacks. By the beginning of 1942, much of the region had been reduced to a depopulated and heavily fortified battlefield. Thus, at the start of 1942, Rzhev stood at the intersection of strategic ambition and operational deadlock. For Germany, it represented a forward bastion securing the Central Front and maintaining pressure on Moscow. For the Soviet Union, it symbolized an unfinished battle whose resolution was tied directly to the security of the capital and the morale of the nation. The conditions were set for a prolonged series of offensives that would transform the Rzhev sector into one of the most sustained and costly battle zones of the entire Eastern Front. The opening phase of the fighting around Rzhev began in January 1942 as part of the broader Soviet winter counteroffensive following the defense of Moscow. The Red Army sought to exploit German exhaustion after the failure of Operation Typhoon and the subsequent retreat of Army Group Center from the outer approaches to the capital. Soviet commanders aimed to convert the German withdrawal into a full encirclement and destruction of the forces remaining inside the Rzhev-Vyazma salient. The initial Soviet attack involved the Kalinin Front from the north and the Western Front from the south, with a combined strength of more than 1.2 million personnel, supported by approximately 1,500 tanks and over 7,600 artillery pieces. Against them stood the German Ninth Army under General Walter Model, numbering roughly 250,000 to 300,000 troops at this stage, with limited armored reserves and a shrinking supply base. German defensive positions relied heavily on field fortifications hastily constructed during the retreat of December 1941. These included trench systems, reinforced strong points within villages, and artillery positions embedded within forest belts. Despite reduced mobility due to winter conditions and fuel shortages, German command maintained effective control over interior lines of communication within the salient. The Soviet offensive opened with simultaneous thrusts towards Sekevka, Zubtsov, and Vyazma. Initial advances achieved tactical gains, pushing German forward elements back several kilometers in multiple sectors. However, the operational depth of the German defense quickly became apparent. As Soviet formations advanced, they encountered successive defensive belts supported by heavy artillery fire. German counterattacks were conducted by mobile reserve groups composed of infantry supported by limited numbers of tanks and assault guns. These countermeasures slowed Soviet momentum and inflicted substantial casualties during the first weeks of fighting. Between January and March 1942, the Battle of Rzhev evolved into a series of interconnected engagements rather than a single continuous operation. Soviet forces launched repeated attempts to close the northern and southern shoulders of the salient. One of the most ambitious efforts occurred during the Rzhev-Vyazma offensive operation, when Soviet troops attempted to encircle German forces by advancing deep behind the front line. Several Soviet formations penetrated up to 30 kilometers into German-controlled territory, but soon found themselves isolated due to insufficient logistical support and German countermaneuvers that cut off supply corridors. Weather conditions imposed severe limitations on both sides. Temperatures frequently fell below -20 degrees Celsius. Snow depth restricted off-road movement, and frozen ground complicated both entrenchment and the evacuation of wounded. Soviet troops suffered from extended supply routes and shortages of winter equipment, while German forces experienced fuel shortages and growing difficulties maintaining vehicles under extreme cold. Frostbite cases accumulated rapidly among both armies. Civilian populations in the region were effectively eliminated as a social factor during this phase. Large areas of the Rzhev district had already been depopulated during earlier fighting and occupation. Those civilians who remained were either evacuated by German forces for labor use or fled on their own as combat zones expanded. Villages were repeatedly destroyed as front lines shifted back and forth, leaving no stable rear area for settlement or recovery. By early April 1942, the initial Soviet attempt to destroy the Rzhev salient had failed to achieve its primary objective. Although Soviet units had inflicted significant losses and gained limited ground, the German Ninth Army remained operational and firmly entrenched. Soviet casualties during the winter offensive in the Rzhev sector are estimated at over 700,000 killed, wounded, or missing. German casualties for the same period are estimated between 150,000 and 200,000. These figures reflected the emergence of Rzhev as a zone of sustained attritional warfare rather than a battlefield of rapid maneuver. The outcome of this opening phase established the pattern that would dominate the Rzhev fighting for more than a year. The salient remained in German hands. Soviet forces prepared for renewed offensives, and both sides transitioned into prolonged positional warfare under conditions of extreme manpower consumption and limited strategic mobility. By the spring of 1942, the struggle for the Rzhev salient had transitioned from a winter pursuit into a planned campaign of strategic exhaustion. Both German and Soviet high commands now viewed Rzhev not as a temporary battlefield, but as a decisive operational axis whose outcome would shape the central sector of the Eastern Front. For the Soviet Union, the strategic objective was clear: eliminate the Rzhev-Vyazma salient, destroy the German Ninth Army, and remove the persistent threat to Moscow. For Germany, the goal was to retain the salient as a forward defensive shield that tied down Soviet forces and stabilized Army Group Center after the failure before Moscow. Soviet planning for renewed operations in mid-1942 relied on large-scale coordinated offensives across multiple fronts. The Stavka assigned the Western Front and the Kalinin Front the task of conducting converging attacks on the northern and southern flanks of the salient. The underlying operational concept was consistent with earlier attempts: penetrate deep behind German lines, disrupt supply routes, and force the encirclement of German forces around Rzhev and Sychevka. Soviet forces allocated for these operations numbered more than 1.5 million personnel across the broader sector, supported by approximately 2,000 tanks and over 10,000 artillery pieces. However, while numerical strength was considerable, logistical and coordination challenges persisted. Supply lines for the Red Army stretched across devastated terrain with limited rail capacity. Bridges had been destroyed during earlier phases of the war, and road networks were poorly suited for heavy transport during spring thaws. Ammunition deliveries, fuel transport, and food supply depended heavily on horse-drawn transport and increasingly overstressed rail corridors east of Moscow. Soviet planning compensated for these limitations by stockpiling supplies forward of the front and relying on rapid massed artillery preparation to compensate for shorter operational endurance. German strategic planning inside the salient centered on fortification and defensive flexibility. The German Ninth Army, still under the command of General Walter Model until summer 1942, supervised the construction of multiple fortified defensive belts. These included extensive trench systems, log-reinforced bunkers, interlocking fields of machine gun fire, dense minefields, and pre-registered artillery kill zones. German engineers converted entire villages into fortified nodes, integrating stone structures into defensive networks. Rail connections linking Rzhev to Smolensk and Vyazma were repaired and prioritized to ensure consistent delivery of ammunition and reinforcements. Logistical reality defined German capabilities. While interior lines of communication allowed for rapid lateral movement within the salient, all long-range supply passed through a limited number of rail corridors vulnerable to Soviet partisan activity and air attack. Fuel shortages, already severe by early 1942, limited the mobility of German armored units. As a result, German planning shifted away from offensive maneuver and towards static defense, supported by mobile reserve groupings positioned to counter Soviet breakthroughs. Propaganda considerations also influenced planning. For the Soviet leadership, capturing Rzhev carried symbolic importance. The city stood barely 200 kilometers from Moscow, and its continued occupation by German forces was perceived as an unresolved threat to the capital. Repeated public references to upcoming offensives helped sustain domestic morale and reinforce the narrative of inevitable German defeat. On the German side, the Rzhev salient was portrayed as a bastion anchoring the central front. used to demonstrate that German forces still maintained operational control despite setbacks elsewhere. Intelligence assessments on both sides contained significant flaws. Soviet intelligence underestimated the depth and sophistication of German fortifications and overestimated the speed at which German reserves could be overwhelmed. German intelligence correctly assessed the likelihood of renewed Soviet mass offensives, but consistently underestimated the scale of Soviet manpower reserves and the rapid recovery of Red Army artillery capacity following earlier losses. By June 1942, the strategic framework for another major confrontation was firmly in place. Both sides had accepted that Rzhev would not be decided by a single decisive blow, but by repeated large-scale operations that consumed manpower and material at high rates. The battlefield had become one of deliberate planning, structured fortification, and industrial-scale logistics rather than fluid operational maneuver. What followed would transform these strategic intentions into one of the most sustained and resource-intensive campaigns of the war. The next phase of fighting around Rzhev began in the summer of 1942, with the opening of the Soviet offensives aimed at dismantling the outer defenses of the salient. On 30th of July 1942, Soviet forces of the Kalinin Front and the Western Front launched coordinated attacks along a broad sector stretching from north of Rzhev toward Sychevka. The primary objective was to penetrate the first German defensive belt, breach rear communication lines, and create conditions for a wider operational encirclement. The initial assault involved multiple combined arms armies, including the Soviet 30th Army and 29th Army in the north, and elements of the 20th and 31st Armies to the south. Artillery preparation preceded the attack with concentrated barrages lasting several hours. Soviet fire missions targeted known German strongpoints, trench networks, and artillery positions identified through reconnaissance and earlier engagements. In several sectors, up to 200 artillery pieces per kilometer were deployed. Despite the intensity of the bombardment, the German defensive system remained largely intact due to the depth of fortifications and extensive use of camouflaged positions. Infantry assaults followed immediately behind the artillery fires. Soviet units advanced across open terrain interspersed with forest belts and marshes, facing interlocking machine gun fire and pre-registered artillery strikes. Progress during the first days of the offensive was limited. In the northern sectors, Soviet advances reached depths of 3 to 7 kilometers in isolated pockets, but failed to achieve sustained breakthroughs. German defensive doctrine emphasized elastic resistance. Forward positions absorbed the initial shock, while mobile reserves from the 9th Army counterattacked penetrations before they could widen. Air operations played a significant role in the early engagements. Soviet aviation attempted to suppress German artillery and disrupt supply columns moving toward the front. German Luftwaffe units, although reduced in strength compared to 1941, maintained temporary local air superiority in several sectors. Tactical bombing missions targeted Soviet assembly areas, river crossings, and ammunition dumps. Losses on both sides were consistent, with limited aircraft availability restricting sustained operations. Civilian populations in contested areas were directly impacted as villages near the front changed hands repeatedly or were destroyed during artillery exchanges. Forced evacuations occurred in areas of expected fighting. Food stocks, livestock, and housing infrastructure were consumed or damaged as both armies requisitioned resources. Displacement of civilians further strained Soviet rear logistics and medical services. German counteractions on the operational level began within 48 hours of the Soviet assault. Reserve infantry divisions and Kampfgruppen, composed of remnants from earlier battles, were committed to seal off penetrations. These counterattacks frequently relied on concentrated artillery fire and local armored support using remaining Panzerfeuer units and self-propelled guns. While German forces lacked the strength for extended counteroffensives, their immediate tactical responses disrupted Soviet momentum at several critical points. By mid-August 1942, the battlefield had settled into a series of localized engagements rather than a continuous forward advance. Soviet forces captured several fortified villages and forest strongpoints, but failed to rupture the core defensive belt, protecting Rzhev and Sychevka. German casualty reports indicated losses in the tens of thousands across the first month of combat, while Soviet losses exceeded German figures by a significant margin due to repeated frontal attacks against prepared positions. The first phase of the summer fighting revealed the fundamental balance of the Rzhev battlefield. Soviet numerical superiority did not easily translate into operational success against layered defensive systems supported by flexible reserves. The initial engagements demonstrated that the struggle for the salient would unfold not as a rapid maneuver campaign, but as a prolonged battle of attrition, fought kilometer by kilometer through entrenched positions under continuous artillery and air attack. As the summer offensives stalled in localized gains rather than decisive breakthroughs, the fighting around the Rzhev salient entered a phase of sustained escalation and operational crisis for both sides. By late August 1942, the Soviet High Command continued to reinforce the Kalinin and Western fronts with fresh formations drawn from strategic reserves. Additional rifle divisions, tank brigades, and artillery regiments were moved into the sector with the intent of renewing pressure before German forces could reorganize fully. The objective remained the same: compress the salient, isolate German forces east of Smolensk, and create conditions for a larger encirclement. On the German side, the Ninth Army under General Walter Model faced steadily rising attrition. Divisions that had already sustained losses during the winter and spring were now stretched across a wide defensive arc under constant artillery fire. Supply lines ran westward through a limited number of road and rail corridors vulnerable to Soviet air and partisan activity. Ammunition expenditure increased sharply, particularly in artillery shells and anti-tank ammunition, while fuel stocks remained constrained by the broader demands of the Eastern Front. From September 1942 onward, the fighting intensified in several specific sectors south and east of Rzhev. Soviet forces attempted repeated thrusts towards Sychevka and Zubtsov, aiming to disrupt German lateral communications inside the salient. These operations typically opened with heavy artillery and mortar fire, followed by infantry assaults supported by T-34 and T-70 tanks. However, the broken terrain of forests, ravines, and rivers limited armored maneuver and forced much of the fighting into close-range engagements. German forces responded with layered defensive measures. Forward trench systems absorbed initial attacks, while anti-tank guns were positioned in depth along forest edges and elevation changes. Mobile reserves, often assembled from understrength battalions, were committed piecemeal to stop Soviet penetrations. In many cases, Soviet units reached the second or third defensive line only to be isolated by flanking fire and counterattacks. Casualty rates increased steadily through the autumn. Soviet daily losses during peak engagements numbered in the thousands across the entire salient. German losses were lower in absolute terms, but significant relative to their available manpower. By October 1942, several German divisions in the Rzhev sector reported effective infantry strengths reduced to 50% or less of authorized numbers. Replacement troops arrived irregularly, often with limited training and equipment. Weather conditions added a further layer of operational difficulty. Autumn rains transformed roads into mud, reducing vehicle movement and slowing the evacuation of wounded. Supply convoys on both sides were delayed for hours or days. Artillery units struggled to reposition heavy guns, and tank operations became increasingly restricted to narrow road corridors. Medical services operated under constant strain as field hospitals filled with casualties, suffering not only from combat wounds, but also from exposure and disease. Civilians remaining in contested villages faced worsening conditions. Food shortages became widespread as harvests were disrupted by artillery fire and requisitioning. Many settlements ceased to function as organized communities and turned into improvised shelter zones for displaced populations. Reports from Soviet rear areas described waves of refugees arriving with minimal possessions and limited access to medical care. By November 1942, the pattern of the Rzhev fighting had hardened into a cycle of Soviet attacks, limited tactical advances, and German counteractions designed to restore the line. Neither side achieved decisive operational success, yet both continued to commit resources due to the strategic importance attached to the salient. The crisis of attrition deepened. Manpower reserves diminished. Supply systems operated under growing strain, and command staffs on both sides confronted the reality that the battle for Rzhev was evolving into one of the most prolonged and resource-intensive struggles on the entire central sector of the Eastern Front. By late November and December 1942, the combat around the Rzhev salient reached the phase that later historians would identify as the operational peak of the entire campaign. While global attention shifted toward the encirclement at Stalingrad, the central sector remained locked in large-scale continuous engagements. Soviet High Command prepared new attacks intended to exploit any weakening of German reserves caused by the crisis in the south. At the same time, the German Ninth Army attempted to stabilize its lines with declining manpower and increasingly fragile logistics. Soviet force concentrations during this period included elements of the 20th, 22nd, 31st, and 39th Armies, supported by multiple independent tank brigades and reinforced artillery groups. Preparatory bombardments grew in scale, with hundreds of guns firing simultaneously in limited sectors. The purpose was not only to break German defensive belts, but also to disrupt command posts, supply routes, and communication hubs within the salient. German intelligence detected these concentrations, but lacked sufficient mobile reserves to preempt them. German formations opposing these forces consisted primarily of depleted infantry divisions, supported by assault gun battalions and limited armored elements. Panzer units assigned to the sector typically operated at under half their authorized strength. For example, some divisions reported fewer than 40 operational armored vehicles available across entire core sectors. Despite this, defensive firepower remained concentrated through dense networks of anti-tank guns, mortars, and field artillery. Fighting during December developed into prolonged engagement cycles. Soviet attacks frequently achieved shallow penetrations measured in hundreds of meters or a few kilometers before stalling under crossfire and airstrikes. German counterattacks, launched with battalion-sized or regimental-sized groupings, aimed at restoring lost positions rather than achieving large maneuvers. The battlefield shifted repeatedly between frozen forests, riverbanks, and shattered villages, whose control changed hands multiple times within weeks. Air operations intensified as well. Soviet ground attack aviation conducted repeated strikes against road junctions and rear area supply depots. German Luftwaffe units responded with close air support and interdiction missions against advancing infantry formations. Weather frequently limited sustained flight operations, but during clear periods, air activity significantly influenced the tempo of ground engagements. Casualty accumulation accelerated sharply. Soviet losses during the winter phase reached into the tens of thousands across multiple armies. German losses continued at a slower numerical rate, but increasingly affected experienced junior officers and non-commissioned cadre, reducing unit cohesion. Medical evacuation systems on both sides suffered delays due to snow-blocked transport routes and overloaded rail capacity. The civilian situation deteriorated further as winter deepened. Entire civilian populations of surviving villages were evacuated or displaced, either by direct military removal or as a result of destruction and resource exhaustion. Food capacity collapsed in wide areas of the salient, leaving many dependent on military distribution or organized evacuation to rear regions. By January 1943, the strategic balance began to shift decisively. The collapse of German forces at Stalingrad forced the German High Command to reconsider the viability of maintaining the Rzhev salient. Sustaining large forces inside an exposed projection now accepted the risk of isolation on a strategic scale similar to what had just occurred in the south. Soviet command, aware of this vulnerability, began preparations for further pressure, designed not only to seize territory, but to impose operational collapse through logistical exhaustion. The peak phase of the Rzhev campaign thus ended not through a single breakthrough, but through the accumulation of attritional effects. Both sides had committed enormous manpower, artillery resources, and air assets without achieving decisive operational encirclement. What followed in early 1943 would transform the nature of the battle from prolonged attrition into a strategic decision point for the entire central sector of the Eastern Front. From January to early February 1943, operations around the Rzhev salient entered a phase defined by tactical adaptation and sustained resistance on both sides. After months of continuous combat, formations on the German and Soviet sides were no longer operating according to original operational plans, but instead relied on improvised structures, shortened command chains, and survival-oriented tactics shaped by attrition and terrain. The front stabilized temporarily, but fighting continued at a persistent intensity across the entire arc of the salient. German forces of the Ninth Army reorganized their depleted divisions into reinforced battle groups built around remaining infantry regiments, assault gun detachments, and artillery batteries. Many divisions that had entered the campaign with authorized strengths of 12,000 to 15,000 personnel now operated with 4,000 to 6,000 effectives. Defensive networks were compressed into shorter trench lines supported by layered minefields, pre-registered artillery fire zones, and concentrated machine gun positions. Forest belts and frozen riverbanks were integrated into defensive geometry to compensate for reduced manpower. Soviet forces similarly adapted their offensive methods after repeated frontal assaults produced limited territorial gains at high cost. Front commanders increased the use of infiltration tactics, night attacks, and engineering detachments specializing in ice crossings and obstacle removal. Assault groups were reorganized into small, flexible units equipped with submachine guns, light mortars, and demolition charges. Tank usage shifted from massed breakthroughs toward supporting infantry advances in narrow corridors where terrain allowed limited maneuver. Artillery remained the primary instrument of tactical influence. Soviet artillery groupings continued to mass hundreds of guns in localized sectors, often firing preparatory barrages lasting several hours. German counter-battery fire responded with pre-calculated fire plans using remaining heavy calibers, including 105 mm and 150 mm howitzers. Ammunition shortages increasingly influenced rates of fire on both sides, especially on the German side, where rail resupply from Western Russia faced sustained disruption. Air operations declined in total sortie volume due to winter weather, but retained localized impact. Soviet aviation focused on interdiction of road links, feeding the salient from Smolensk and Vyazma, while German aircraft concentrated on defensive support over threatened bridgeheads and trench sectors. Loss rates fluctuated widely, depending on weather windows and localized air superiority, often changing daily. Psychological and physical exhaustion became a central operational factor. Units on both sides experienced shortened rotation cycles, with some companies remaining in forward trenches for weeks at a time. Frost injuries, respiratory disease, and malnutrition increasingly affected combat readiness. Soviet archival figures show rising non-combat casualties during this period, while German medical services reported similar trends compounded by reduced evacuation capacity. Partisan activity behind German lines intensified during this phase. Rail sabotage, ambushes of supply convoys, and disruption of communication lines forced the German command to divert increasing numbers of security and rear echelon units away from frontline reinforcement. Soviet intelligence networks expanded in coordination with regular army operations, providing updated information on garrison rotations, depot locations, and transport vulnerabilities. Civilian displacement continued across the region. Villages previously used as logistical hubs or shelter zones were cleared entirely as front lines shifted. Agricultural output ceased across most of the salient, eliminating local food sources for both military and civilian populations. Survivors were either evacuated by Soviet authorities during temporary advances or relocated by German occupation administrations to rear labor zones. By mid-February 1943, it became evident that neither side retained the operational potential to resolve the Rzhev sector through direct assault alone. The battlefield had shifted into a condition of large-scale mutual containment, supported by continuous adaptation. The conflict here was no longer driven by rapid maneuver or decisive encirclement, but by the capacity to maintain cohesion, supply, and command under long-term attritional pressure. The next phase would not emerge from tactical adjustments alone, but from strategic-level decisions involving the entire Eastern Front. By late February and into March 1943, the strategic balance around the Rzhev salient shifted decisively as German High Command initiated a large-scale controlled withdrawal known as Operation Büffel. This marked the critical turning point of the entire Rzhev campaign. After more than a year of continuous fighting, the German Ninth Army was ordered to evacuate the exposed salient and redeploy to shorten defensive lines further west. The decision was driven by worsening manpower shortages, logistical overstretch, and the wider collapse of German strategic positions following the defeat at Stalingrad. The withdrawal plan was prepared in detail over several weeks. Approximately 20 divisions, forming the core of the Ninth Army, were assigned to disengage in phases between 1 and 22 March 1943. At the start of the operation, German strength in the salient remained substantial, with estimates ranging between 250,000 and 300,000 personnel, supported by roughly 400 armored vehicles and over 2,000 artillery pieces. Soviet forces arrayed against them comprised more than 1 million personnel across Kalinin and Western Front formations, supported by over 2,500 tanks and self-propelled guns. German evacuation unfolded through a carefully layered system of rearguard defenses, mine belts, and destruction of infrastructure. Rail junctions, bridges, road networks, depots, and civilian buildings were systematically demolished. Over 1,000 kilometers of rail track were destroyed. More than 130 bridges were blown. Entire towns and villages were evacuated and then burned. Soviet units advancing into evacuated areas encountered extensive minefields, booby traps, and collapsed crossings that delayed pursuit and caused significant casualties among engineers and forward infantry elements. Soviet command initially detected the German withdrawal only after large sections of the forward trench system were found abandoned. Once confirmed, Soviet frontal and army-level formations were ordered to pursue. However, pursuit encountered severe limitations. The German rear guards executed delaying actions using pre-positioned artillery, mobile anti-tank screens, and pre-registered fire zones. Snow depth, mud from early thaw conditions, and destroyed infrastructure further slowed Soviet movement. Tank formations operating at the front edge faced chronic fuel shortages and limited repair capability as they advanced into devastated terrain. Air reconnaissance confirmed that German evacuation was occurring across multiple corridors simultaneously, preventing Soviet command from concentrating pursuit at a single decisive penetration point. German evacuation columns operated mostly by night, heavily camouflaged and protected by mobile flak units. Soviet aviation increased sortie rates during daylight windows, but achieved limited interdiction success due to weather conditions and dispersal of movement routes. Casualties during the withdrawal phase continued to mount. Soviet after-action reports estimate that approximately 38,000 German troops were killed during rearguard fighting and evacuation-related engagements. German operational reports acknowledged losses, but emphasized the preservation of the bulk of heavy equipment and the successful extrication of most formations. Soviet casualties during pursuit and mine-clearing operations between March 1 and March 31st exceeded 120,000 killed and wounded, according to later archival assessments. Civilian impact reached its maximum intensity during this phase. German evacuation orders included forced deportations of able-bodied civilians, destruction of farms, removal of livestock, and seizure of remaining food stocks. Thousands of civilians were displaced into winter terrain without shelter or transport. Soviet authorities later recorded entire districts where no intact housing remained after the German withdrawal. By late March 1943, the Rzhev salient ceased to exist as an operational formation. Soviet units fully reoccupied Rzhev, Vyazma adjacent sectors, and the surrounding forest industrial region. The front line stabilized on a new strategic axis that ran farther west, closer to Smolensk and Orsha. The turning point did not take the form of a sudden breakthrough, encirclement, or surrender, but of a calculated disengagement that ended one of the longest continuous battles of the Eastern Front, without a formally declared conclusion. The disappearance of the Rzhev battlefield from active maps did not signify resolution in human terms. The terrain left behind was structurally erased, contaminated by explosives, and saturated with unburied casualties. The transition into the aftermath phase would reveal the long-term consequences of a campaign that had consumed forces on an unprecedented scale without producing a single decisive victory. With the completion of Operation Büffel in late March 1943, active large-scale combat in the Rzhev sector formally ended, but the immediate aftermath unfolded as a separate phase of devastation, fragmentation, and humanitarian crisis. Soviet formations advancing into the evacuated zone encountered a territory that had been systematically stripped of infrastructure and resources. Urban centers such as Rzhev, Sychevka, Bailey, and dozens of surrounding settlements were found in various stages of destruction. In many localities, more than 80% of buildings were damaged or completely demolished. Rail hubs were rendered unusable, water systems destroyed, and farmland saturated with unexploded ordnance. Soviet casualty accounting for the entire Rzhev campaign continued well into mid-1943. Archival tabulations compiled by the General Staff later recorded total losses of approximately 1,225,000 personnel for Soviet forces between January 1942 and March 1943, including killed, wounded, missing, and captured. German losses across the same period are estimated between 400,000 and 450,000 personnel, though precise breakdowns remain incomplete due to the relocation and destruction of unit records during the retreat. Equipment losses on both sides included more than 2,500 tanks destroyed, disabled, or abandoned, and over 6,000 artillery pieces rendered unusable. German forces successfully re-established coherent defensive lines along shortened positions west of the former salient. The evacuated 9th Army formations were redistributed to reinforce Army Group Center and sectors threatened by anticipated Soviet summer offensives. In organizational terms, the withdrawal preserved divisional cohesion and heavy equipment stocks, but the personnel structure of many units was already degraded by attrition exceeding 50% of original strength in multiple divisions. Replacements arriving during spring and summer 1943 increasingly consisted of younger age groups and partially trained reserve contingents. For the Soviet side, redeployment from the Rzhev sector followed immediately after reoccupation. Multiple combined arms armies were reassigned toward the Smolensk axis, Bryansk front, and Kursk region. The manpower released by the closure of the salient contributed directly to the force concentrations later used in the summer campaigns. However, the logistical burden created by the devastated Rzhev zone remained unresolved. Rail reconstruction required months of labor, with critical corridors reopened only by early summer. Engineer units undertook large-scale clearance operations, removing an estimated 1.3 million mines and explosive devices between April and August 1943. Civilian conditions after liberation reflected the cumulative impact of 15 months of combat, occupation, and scorched earth withdrawal. Soviet administrative surveys documented that in many districts fewer than 10% of pre-war residents remained. Mass graves and unburied remains were discovered across forest belts, former trench lines, and village outskirts. Medical infrastructure in the region had effectively ceased to exist. Famine conditions emerged in several districts during the summer of 1943 due to destroyed agricultural capacity and contaminated soils. Population movement followed two parallel patterns: partial return of evacuated civilians under military supervision and forced relocation of surviving residents into labor brigades tasked with reconstruction. Thousands of former inhabitants returned to sites where only foundations remained. Temporary shelter consisted of dugouts, tent barracks, and repurposed German field structures. Disease outbreaks, including typhus and dysentery, were registered during spring and early summer, intensifying the non-combat mortality that followed the end of military operations. At the strategic level, the termination of the Rzhev campaign altered the geometry of the Eastern Front. The removal of the German salient eliminated a constant threat to Soviet rear areas near Moscow and reduced the operational reach of Army Group Center. At the same time, the lack of a decisive encirclement meant that a substantial German force survived to fight in subsequent operations. The front did not collapse at Rzhev, but it no longer exerted the stabilizing pressure that had constrained Soviet maneuver for more than a year. By early April 1943, direct combat in the Rzhev region ceased entirely. What remained was a landscape transformed into a continuous zone of destruction, logistical exhaustion, and demographic rupture. The physical withdrawal of armies marked only the end of fighting, not the end of consequences. The final phase of the Rzhev battle was no longer defined by maneuver or firepower, but by reconstruction, displacement, and the long accounting of losses that extended far beyond the battlefield itself. The historical significance of the Rzhev campaign emerged gradually in the years following the war, shaped by incomplete documentation, political sensitivities, and the extraordinary scale of losses sustained over a prolonged period without decisive territorial resolution. For nearly 2 decades after 1945, many operational details regarding Rzhev remained classified or only partially referenced in official Soviet histories. The absence of a clear victory narrative, combined with the absence of a final encirclement or capitulation, placed Rzhev outside the dominant framework of celebrated wartime successes. From a strategic perspective, the Rzhev operations fulfilled a containment function rather than a breakthrough role. Between January 1942 and March 1943, Army Group Center was fixed in place, unable to redeploy major mobile formations toward the southern sectors where battles unfolded at Stalingrad, the Don Basin, and later Kursk. German high command assessments from early 1942 onward repeatedly cited the necessity of maintaining large armored and infantry reserves inside the Rzhev salient, despite pressure elsewhere. This constraint shaped the allocation of German operational reserves across the Eastern Front during a critical transitional phase of the war. For the Red Army, the campaign represented an extended phase of operational learning under extreme conditions. Multiple command-level failures during early offensives produced heavy losses, but by late 1942 and early 1943, improvements in artillery coordination, air-ground integration, and logistics began to influence planning methods used later during the Smolensk and Kursk operations. Rzhev did not produce the type of breakthrough seen elsewhere, but it served as a testing ground for evolving Soviet operational doctrine at extremely high material cost. The memory of Rzhev among veterans differed markedly from officially sanctioned narratives. Survivors described months of repeated assaults against fortified forest lines with minimal territorial change. The designation, the meat grinder, did not originate from propaganda, but from soldiers documenting the protracted nature of combat, where advances were measured in hundreds of meters over weeks of fighting. Veteran memoirs published after the 1960s began to establish a parallel record that diverged from earlier official summaries. In post-war German military historiography, Rzhev was analyzed primarily as an example of successful large-scale withdrawal under pressure rather than as a battle in its own right. Operation Büffel became a case study in defensive disengagement, controlled retreat, and denial operations. However, this framing tended to exclude consideration of the long-term consequences for civilian populations in the evacuated areas and the attrition already absorbed by German units prior to withdrawal. Demographically, the Rzhev region never returned to its pre-war population density. Census data from the 1950s and 1960s show significant permanent population loss, with numerous villages never resettled. Entire administrative districts were merged due to depopulation. Agricultural output from the region recovered slowly, hindered by soil contamination, infrastructure destruction, and labor shortages lasting well into the post-war reconstruction period. Commemoration of Rzhev remained uneven for decades. A limited number of memorial sites were established during the Soviet period, but large-scale national recognition did not occur until the late 20th and early 21st centuries. In 2020, the opening of the Rzhev Memorial to the Soviet soldier marked a formal institutional recognition of the campaign's scale and significance. The monument was constructed on terrain where multiple assault waves had occurred, incorporating archival casualty data into its design narrative. Today, Rzhev occupies a complex position in historical memory. It represents neither a decisive victory nor a catastrophic defeat in conventional operational terms. Instead, it stands as an example of prolonged positional warfare under winter conditions with sustained human and material expenditure. The campaign illustrates the structural character of the Eastern Front during 1942 and early 1943, where large formations could remain locked in place for over a year, with continuous losses and minimal territorial change. The long-term legacy of Rzhev lies not in a single battlefield outcome, but in its demonstration of attritional warfare at the strategic level. It reveals how front stability itself could become an instrument of war, consuming forces over time while shaping the broader operational environment.